Tell me to stop.
That seems wildly unlikely.
This is an appallingly unprofessional use of county property.
Then arrest me.
Welcome back to Two Hearts, where stories are woven together to explore the beauty of diverse cultures and the depths of human connection. Follow along in a return to Meadow Grove, where the passing of time only amplifies a couple's story of true love, danger, healing, and a hard-won forever. This sequel to Jake and Ava's origin story in Copper and Clay finds the pair facing a personal secret, a town-wide celebration, and a dangerous investigation that collide to test their trust, their courage, and the life they fought so hard to build together. If you loved watching two strong-willed hearts find home in each other, come back to Meadow Grove and read the next chapter of Jake and Ava's journey. And P.S. True Two Heart fans, be on the lookout for an Easter egg with Thompson ties. Please enjoy The Shape of Forever. And as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so that more members of our community continue to find content like this.
It had felt like a lifetime had passed since a chaotic storm from the north had nearly taken everything from them. But in truth, it had only been 18 months. Since then, Meadow Grove had resettled into the kind of stability that made people believe in promises. The summer sun poured gold over the river at dawn. The diner doors swung open before the heat rose. Wind moved through mesquite and cottonwood with a low, contented hush. And on Main Street, every third conversation seemed to begin and end with the same topic. Sheriff Jake Caldwell and Ava Thompson were finally getting married. At least that was what the town thought. The truth belonged to only 4 people besides the bride and groom. Shelley Granger knew. Giselle Auyekta knew. Cheryl Glenn at Dispatch knew, because Cheryl somehow knew everything that happened in Meadow Grove before it finished happening. The rest of the town was planning for a wedding in late September with all the enthusiasm normally reserved for festivals, homecoming games, and weather warnings. There were fabric swatches circulating between the women at church. There were arguments at Canyon Cross Diner over whether smoked brisket or roasted chicken made the better reception supper. Boots and Buckles had even offered to close for one evening if Jake and Ava wanted to use the dance floor for the celebration. Nobody suspected that the marriage license had been signed nearly 6 months before in a small county office 2 towns over, with only a tired clerk in Shelley's pearl earrings to witness it. The secret had not been born out of shame. It had been born out of need. After everything that had happened with Daniel Elliott, after the hospital, after the charges, after the long and ugly process of pulling apart the lies he had hidden in Ava's life, peace had felt too precious to place under public scrutiny. Jake had wanted to stand in front of God and anybody with eyes and tell the whole world that Ava was his wife. Ava had wanted that too. But she had also wanted one stretch of their happiness that belonged only to them, untouched by gossip, speculation, or the shadows of what had come before. So, one brilliant autumn morning, she'd worn a cream-colored dress and a smile too luminous to look at directly, and Jake had stood beside her in his best dark suit with the same solemn intensity he brought to every vow worth keeping. He had slipped the ring on her finger with a hand steadier than hers, and when the clerk said, very matter-of-factly, that they were now husband and wife, Jake had looked at Ava with such naked wonder that she had nearly cried right there under the buzzing fluorescent lights. They told themselves they would announce it in a month. Then after the summer fundraiser. Then after Jake wrapped up a task force initiative with the State Patrol. Then after Ava launched her back-to-school ceramics series and hired her first part-time assistant. Their private beginning grew roots, and before either of them quite understood how, the secret transformed into a strange little treasure they guarded fiercely. The public wedding became a compromise and then, unexpectedly, a joy. They would do it later, Ava had said. They would gather everyone they loved and do it right. They would celebrate what had already begun. If the truth were told, the months of secret marriage that followed had not been made only of hidden rings and practical scheduling. It had been made of discovery. The thrilling, unsettling, deeply private discovery of how marriage changed the air between two people, even when almost nobody knew. Jake had always been attentive when they were dating. As her husband, he became quietly devastating. He learned where her tension lived and pressed his thumbs there when she sat too long at the wheel. He would pause in doorways just to look at her, and the weight of that look alone could make Ava forget what she'd gone into a room to do. On cool desert nights, he built fires out back and pulled her between his knees in the porch swing while the river muttered in the dark. Sometimes he talked. More often, he simply held her with his chin resting near her shoulder, one broad hand spread over her stomach as if her breathing steadied something in him. Ava, who had once equated grand romance with spectacle, discovered that intimacy could be made of smaller things. The reverent patience with which he zipped her dress before church, the way he said, "Come here," when he wanted closeness and never once made it sound like a command, the quiet contentment of waking before dawn to find him already awake, watching her as though he still could not believe she belonged to him and he to her. And Ava belonged to him in no diminished way. That was the miracle. She had feared, after Daniel, that belonging to a man would always cost her some essential piece of self. Jake proved the opposite. With him, being loved felt expansive. She still ran her business with ambition, still argued beautifully, still wore clothes Meadow Grove sometimes did not deserve, still corrected people when they confused curiosity with entitlement. But now there were evenings when she would come home dusty and tired, find Jake in the kitchen with his sleeves rolled to his forearms, and feel something almost embarrassingly tender unfurl inside her. He would glance up from chopping onions or checking the stovetop, and that severe sheriff's face would alter instantly. Then she would set down her bag, cross the room without preamble, and let him take her in with both hands at her waist before any greeting was spoken. Those moments often began in laughter and ended in the kind of lingering embrace that made dinner late and the whole house feel warmer. There had been one rain-heavy evening in early spring when the power flickered out across the township and Meadow Grove disappeared into velvet darkness. Ava lit candles all over the house while Jake checked the breaker and the old porch lantern. When he came back inside, shoulders damp with rain and the outline of his shirt clinging obscenely to his back and chest, he found her barefoot in the kitchen laughing at her own inability to locate the matches she had just been holding. He took them from her back pocket, set them down, and stood looking at her in the candlelight as if something ancient and patient in him had finally run out of restraint. She remembered every part of that moment, the low thunder outside, the glow on the planes of his face, the slow way he reached up and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear before letting his fingers trail down the side of her throat. She had leaned into that touch without thought. The kiss that followed was unhurried, deepening by increments, all the more intoxicating because Jake kissed her like a man who knew exactly how much he wanted and still treated her as if he had all the time in the world. By the time they made it to the living room sofa, candles trembling on every surface and rain drumming softly on the roof, Ava had discovered that passion did not have to be frantic to be overwhelming. Sometimes it was devastating precisely because it was so carefully chosen. She thought of that night now whenever Jake brushed his mouth against her wrist where her pulse raced or stood behind her at the bathroom sink and folded himself around her while she removed earrings at the end of a long day. Everybody else in town got the hard angles of him, the rigid posture, the command voice, the capacity for decisive force. Ava got the man who would stop in the middle of a sentence to kiss the inside of her shoulder because her blouse had slipped. The man who read her moods by the set of her mouth. The man who, once the bedroom door closed, touched her with a reverence so intimate it made her feel chosen over and over again. Meadow Grove saw that she softened him. What they did not know was how much he unmade her too, not into weakness, but into openness, the kind that let love in fully and asked for nothing less than truth in return. Now later had arrived, and Ava stood in the back room of copper and clay, hands braced on the broad worktable she used for glazing, staring at a stack of linen samples Shelley had left for her to consider for the reception tables. The little cards were fanned in neat rows of ivory, sandstone, sage, and a deep terracotta that made Ava think of evening canyons after rain. Behind her, the studio hummed with the sounds of a Wednesday class ending. Laughter, the scrape of stools, the happy chatter of teenagers trying not to sound too pleased with their own work. Ava touched the wedding band hidden beneath the larger engagement ring she wore for everyone to see. It was a habit now, subtle and private, the light brush of her thumb over warm gold whenever she thought of him. Sometimes she did it in the market when she heard Jake's voice at the end of an aisle. Sometimes she did it when she watched his cruiser roll down Main Street at dusk. Sometimes she did it late at night when he was beside her, one arm heavy across her waist, and she woke for no reason except to reassure herself that this life was real. Her life in Meadow Grove was real. That still surprised her some days. Chicago had trained her to move quickly, talk quickly, decide quickly, and keep enough armor around her heart to survive polished disappointments. Meadow Grove moved at another rhythm entirely. It asked for patience. It asked her to wave when people waved, to learn 3 generations of family history before she finished buying apples, to accept that some problems were solved with official meetings while others were solved by somebody's grandmother walking over with a pie and an opinion. At first, Ava had worn her city instincts like a shield. The town had noticed. Then, little by little, she had learned which parts of herself were worth softening and which parts were worth defending. She had become not less herself here, but more. Less reactive. More rooted. Still sharp. Still stylish. Still capable of reducing a pushy salesman to silence with one look. But also willing to laugh when Shelley told her she could not possibly wear white linen heels to an outdoor rehearsal dinner in September. Willing to let Giselle teach her the names of local wildflowers. Willing, most miraculously of all, to belong. And Jake had made belonging feel less like surrender and more like arriving. She heard him before she saw him. Not the cruiser, that was still a block away. But Jake had a particular way of entering a room, a shift in air pressure, a hush in the bones of a place, as if every corner instinctively made room for him. Even here in the studio, with a kiln cooling in the back and students calling goodbyes, Ava felt the shape of his presence approaching. Her pulse answered first. The front bell jingled. Somebody laughed too brightly. Then Shelley's voice floated in from the retail side of the shop. Well, look who suddenly remembered he has a fiancé. Ava smiled before she could stop herself. When Jake stepped into the back room a moment later, he filled the doorway in pressed khaki uniform pants, dark shirt, badge, and the kind of expression that usually made criminals reconsider their options. His jaw was set, his shoulders broad enough to eclipse the light, his hat tucked beneath one arm. But the instant his gaze found Ava, that severe look altered. Not vanished. Jake Caldwell's face did not soften easily. It changed by degrees. The hard line around his mouth loosened. The glacial blue of his eyes warmed. Something gentler came through the discipline, like sunlight breaking under storm cloud. It happened every time. The town had noticed. The town had opinions. You're late, Ava said, though she was already moving toward him. County call ran long. He looked at the linen cards spread across the table. You still choosing between shades of dirt? It is not dirt. It's sandstone. And sage. And whatever this one is pretending to be. She held up the faintest colored card and narrowed her eyes at it. This color has no convictions. Jake took the card from her, studied it with false gravity, then set it down. I'm arresting it for indecision. She laughed, and the sound did something dangerous to him. Ava saw it happen. Saw the quick flare in his eyes. Saw the way his fingers flexed as if resisting the urge to reach for her. They were alone in the back room now. The last student had gone. Shelley, mercifully or strategically, had taken her paperwork and her grin to the front register. Jake stepped closer until the worktable pressed cool and solid into the backs of Ava's hands. How late are you open? He asked. For customers. 15 minutes. Her voice came out lower than she intended. Were sheriffs asking leading questions? Depends. His gaze dropped to her mouth, then lifted again with visible effort. Good, he said quietly. Because I'd like to take my wife home. The word moved through her like heat. Wife, he still said it sometimes as if testing a miracle. In private, in the dark, in the low moments between breathing and sleep, Jake would murmur it against her temple or into the skin below her ear, and Ava would feel the whole length of her life tilting toward him. You can't say things like that in public, she whispered. Then come closer so it's not public. She did because it was impossible not to. Jake bent his head and brushed a kiss at the corner of her mouth. It was brief, almost chaste, but the restraint in it made it more intimate, not less. He smelled like cedar, clean cotton sun, and the faint metallic tang of long hours spent working. Ava slid one hand up the center of his chest, feeling the hard, steady beat beneath her palm. His breath shifted. One of his hands came to rest at her waist, broad and warm, spanning her as if he could anchor her to the earth with that touch alone. You look tired, she murmured. I was until I saw you. Ava rolled her eyes, but the look she gave him was pure affection. That was smooth. I'm married now. I've grown reckless. She smiled again, slower this time, and in that smile was the whole strange and beautiful map of how they had changed each other. Jake had taught her that devotion could be reliable, practical, and fierce. Not performative. Not polished for public consumption. Real. He fixed loose steps on the front porch without being asked. He turned up with coffee exactly the way she liked it on mornings after thunderstorms because he knew she slept lightly when the sky sounded angry. He listened when she ranted about supply costs, bridal rumors, and the absurd fact that half the county seemed invested in what kind of cake she should serve at a wedding she had already had. In return, Ava had taught him softness did not weaken a man. She had coaxed laughter from him in rooms where everybody else only got nods. She had pulled him into her studio and shown him how to center clay with patient hands, then stood behind him to guide his wrists until he forgot to be self-conscious. She had given him a place where his shoulders lowered, where silence was not vigilance, where he was not Sheriff Caldwell, not Unit 1, not the last hard line standing between danger and everybody else. With her, he was simply Jake. A husband. A man. A heart entirely accounted for. That was why the call that came over his radio 1 minute later changed his face so completely that Ava felt the temperature in the room drop. Unit 1. Cheryl's voice crackled through the radio clipped to his shoulder. State is relaying unusual movement northwest of the Wash. Unmarked utility van, no plates visible. Last seen heading east toward township roads. Jake straightened instantly. Every trace of warmth vanished behind discipline. Copy any passenger count. Negative. Report says vehicles riding low. Could be cargo. Cargo, the word lodged in Ava's mind like grit. A year ago, when she first met Jake, illegal crossings near Meadow Grove had been a point of tension between them. A subject loaded with suspicion and assumptions neither of them fully trusted in the other. Since then, she had learned far more than she ever wanted to know about the stretch of rough desert and river routes outside town. Some crossings were exactly what people feared: organized smuggling, desperate runs, criminal exploitation. But some were stranger, sadder, harder to fit into the blunt language of rumor and politics. Families separated across lines invisible in the daylight and lethal at night. Runaways. Trafficking victims moved through back roads like contraband. People used and discarded by men who profited from secrecy. Jake had changed the way he talked about it over the past year. Ava had noticed that too. He had become less certain of easy categories and more relentless about the human damage beneath them. He met her eyes. I need to go. I know. His hand tightened once on her waist, then released. Lock up right after Shelley leaves. Don't drive home alone if it gets late. Call me if anything feels off. Ava arched one brow. That was almost romantic. He bent again, this time resting his forehead against hers for one brief, private second. For me, it is. Then he was gone. By dusk, the story had spread in fragments. Jake and two deputies had intercepted the van near an abandoned feed road. The driver had ditched on foot into the scrub. Inside the vehicle, they found not drugs, not weapons, not undocumented laborers as some of the early chatter in town had greedily assumed, but 3 frightened girls and 1 unconscious woman, all scantily clad, all dehydrated, all transported under false promises of work. The youngest could not have been older than 15. When Jake came home past midnight, Ava was waiting at the kitchen table with the porch light on and a lamp burning low. He crossed the room in 4 long strides and gathered her into his arms so abruptly her chair legs scraped the floor. She went willingly, instantly, wrapping herself around him as best she could. His body felt carved from fatigue and fury. His cheek pressed into her hair. "Hey," she whispered. Jake did not answer right away. He just held her. His control was always meticulous, always exacting, but there were moments when the cost of it showed in the way he exhaled. This was one of them. Ava felt his pulse thundering at the base of his throat. Finally, he pulled back enough to look at her. "You need to know something before the town starts saying it wrong." Ava nodded and led him to sit. He scrubbed a hand over his face. This wasn't random movement through the county. Somebody's routing women through old service roads and staging them near the river. Promising jobs, marriages, sponsorships, whatever works. Then they're passed along. Quiet, fast, hard to trace. Ava's stomach tightened. Trafficking. Yes. He said it with the clipped force he used when emotion had to be compressed into one syllable, or it would become too much to manage. Ava covered his hand with hers. He turned his palm upward at once and laced their fingers. Even shaken, even exhausted, he reached for connection with her as if it were instinct now. "There's more," he said. And when he told her, the room seemed to tilt. One of the girls had been carrying a folded brochure from a charitable arts initiative in Chicago. It was old, creased, and had Ava's name on the back in Daniel Elliott's handwriting. Ava stared at him. "That's impossible." "I know." Jake's jaw tightened. "I'm not saying Daniel was part of this. He's still in federal custody awaiting sentencing. But somehow that paper ended up with one of the victims. And the woman in the van, before she passed out again, she kept repeating one phrase to the medic. Copper and clay." The silence after that was not empty. It was charged with everything both of them feared to say. Ava's business name. Her space. Her town. Their life. Something from the ruin of her old life had found a path into the center of her new one, and neither of them yet understood how. The next week turned the town taut with whispers. The official story released to the public was minimal. There had been a law enforcement operation. Several vulnerable individuals had been recovered. An investigation was ongoing. Meadow Grove took the announcement and did what Meadow Grove always did. It elaborated, embroidered, and then passed its own version around over coffee and fence lines. Some people, to Ava's profound disgust, still wanted to treat the whole thing as a talking point about outsiders and borders. Others were horrified by the idea that women and girls had been moved through the county under the nose of ordinary life. That second reaction spread faster. Donations appeared for shelters 2 counties over. Church groups organized toiletries and clothing drives. Giselle spent one entire lunch hour at Copper and Clay, ranting that every last man involved ought to be sentenced to hard labor under a pitiless sun. Shelley agreed and punctuated the speech by reorganizing Ava's display shelves with militant precision. Ava, meanwhile, could not stop thinking about the brochure. She remembered the initiative dimly. Daniel had once volunteered Ava's design skills for a glossy philanthropic campaign attached to one of Allegiance Financial's community outreach programs. He had liked causes that photographed well. She had created branding, digital flyers, and donor packets while he praised her talent in public and treated her labor like free polish in private. After the scandal broke and federal investigators descended on every corner of his professional life, Ava had never wanted to think about those projects again. But now fragments rose from memory with alarming clarity: an inchoate nonprofit, a cultural exchange promise, an arts apprenticeship pathway for young women in unstable economic situations. Had it all been fake? Or had something legitimate been hijacked by criminals who understood how to dress exploitation in respectable language? Jake did not want her near the investigation. He tried not to say that directly. Jake had learned over the course of their relationship that forbidding Ava Thompson from doing anything simply ensured she would do it with better shoes and more determination. Instead, he was careful, strategic, and maddeningly calm. "If you remember anything useful, tell me," he said one evening as they stood in their kitchen, his service belt on the counter between them, dinner cooling because neither had really touched it. "Do not chase it yourself." Ava folded her arms. "I'm not planning to throw myself into a van, Jake. That is not reassuring. What do you want me to do? Pretend this has nothing to do with me." He looked at her then, really looked, and all the hidden strain of the past few days showed. "I want you safe." The simplicity of it disarmed her. She crossed to him at once. "I know." Jake planted both hands on her hips and drew her close until there was no space left for argument. "No," he said quietly. "I don't think you do." His voice had changed. Gone lower. Rougher. The dangerous edge in him was not aimed at her, but it was there all the same, born of fear and fatigue and the effort of holding himself in check. Ava rested her hands against his chest. Beneath her palms, his body was all disciplined strength and restrained motion. "Jake, you are my weakness," he said, with the kind of blunt honesty that left no room for retreat. "I can make decisions under pressure. I can walk into ugly situations and do what has to be done. But when your name gets pulled into it, everything in me wants to stop thinking and start breaking whatever is in reach." Ava's breath caught. That is an alarming confession from a county sheriff. "I didn't say I would. I said I want to." The look he gave her after that was almost unbearable in its intensity. Ava lifted one hand and cupped his face, letting her thumb move once across the hard line of his cheekbone. "Then let me be your strength too," she said softly. "You do not have to carry every threat by yourself." Something in him yielded. He bent and kissed her, slow at first, then with gathering force. The kiss tasted of restraint finally abandoned. Ava rose onto her toes, fingers sliding into the thick hair at the back of his head. Jake made a low sound in his throat, one she felt more than heard. He backed her gently against the edge of the counter, hands careful and reverent even as the need in them turned urgent. It was a familiar paradox with him. All that control, all that toughness, all that coiled power, and beneath it a tenderness so profound it could undo her. When he finally pulled back, their foreheads touched, breaths mingling in the warm kitchen air. "Tell me what you remember," he said again. So she did. Over the next 2 hours, Ava dug through old files stored in a locked cabinet in the study. She found mock-ups, logo drafts, donor lists, and a sequence of emails she had printed long ago because Daniel's office had once suffered a server sync problem, and he liked hard copies when he wanted to seem important. Jake sat at the table beside her in a t-shirt now, uniform shirt discarded, reading line by line with that relentless focus that made lesser men confess. Together they started seeing the shape of it. The arts initiative had been real enough at the surface. Grants, travel stipends, job placements. But buried in the paperwork were referral pathways through private contracting firms, relocation sponsors, and transitional housing entities so vaguely named they could have hidden anything. Several names repeated. One in particular snagged Ava's eye, Meadow Grove Logistics. Jake leaned forward. "I've heard that before." Ava turned to him. "Where?" "On a scrap manifest from a seizure 6 months ago. We thought it was a ghost company. Dead-end paperwork. Nothing solid enough to build a case." His mouth thinned. Maybe it was never about freight. The realization sat between them with terrible weight. Daniel's financial crimes had not merely been the sins of greed and ambition, Ava already knew. Around the edges of his polished world had existed another network entirely, one that traded in vulnerable people while respectable institutions provided cover, introductions, and language. It might not have begun with Daniel, and it might not end with him, but the harm had brushed her life long before she understood it. That was the past now rising to meet them. Not a single violent man from Ava's history, but an architecture of deceit, exploitation, and bought legitimacy. And somehow, somewhere in that architecture, copper and clay had become a beacon. 3 days later, Ava found out how. A woman came into the studio just before closing, wearing a cheap sun hat and carrying a canvas bag with both hands clutched around the strap. She was in her 30s perhaps, though strain had blurred the lines of age in her face. She did not browse. She did not greet. She looked straight at Ava and asked in halting English, "You are the clay woman." Ava set down the bowl she was wrapping for a customer. "I am." The woman nodded once and pulled a folded flyer from her bag. Ava recognized it immediately. One of her early copper and clay promotional pieces, the one she had distributed all over Meadow Grove and Evercrest when she first opened. On the back, someone had written in careful block letters, "Safe if you find the woman." A chill moved over Ava's skin. "Who gave you this?" she asked. The woman's eyes filled instantly. "Girl in house," she said. "She say if I get out, find copper and clay, find Ava. You help. You call Ava's pulse kicked hard. "Shelly," she called sharply toward the office. "Lock the front door." Jake was there in 6 minutes. The woman's name was Rosa. Between Ava's patient questions, Jake's measured presence, and Giselle, summoned because her Spanish was far better than Ava's, they pieced together a fractured account. Rosa had been lured across state lines with the promise of domestic work and legal sponsorship. Unfortunately, she and several others had been moved between properties under the supervision of men who had helped themselves and never used the same names twice. One young woman among them had seen an old copper and clay flyer wrapped around ceramics at a church market weeks earlier and hidden it. She had memorized the name because she used to work with clay in her hometown, because beauty was rare where they kept her, and because another woman recognized Ava's full name from one of Daniel Elliott's donor brochures, the kind that promised apprenticeships, relocation help, and safe placements for women with nowhere stable to go. That was how the two names fused in their minds. Daniel had supplied the language. Copper and clay had become the rumor of escape. Among the women, they had started whispering it like a code: "Find the clay woman and she will call the law." But Rosa had one more detail. One that snapped Jake upright in his chair. She described a property with a dry well, corrugated fencing, and a view of 3 white storage tanks near an arroyo. Ava had never heard of it. Jake had. It sat just outside Meadow Grove jurisdiction in a forgotten undeveloped pocket near the county line. On paper, the yard had once been leased by Meadow Grove Logistics for equipment transfer. More recently, one of Meadow Grove's most trusted civic charities had listed the same address in a sponsorship packet as temporary overflow housing for women and seasonal workers. The charity board might have been ignorant. It might not. Either way, respectable local paperwork had been used to make a trafficking site look charitable. Jake felt the shape of the danger instantly. If that connection got out before he knew who signed off on it, Meadow Grove would not just be frightened. It would tear itself apart. Jake left before dawn with deputies, county units, and 2 investigators from the state task force. He did not tell Ava everything, which meant what he was not saying was bad enough to tighten his mouth into a line she had learned to fear. He kissed her in the mudroom with one hand at the back of her neck and the other braced on the doorframe, as if he needed the house itself to steady him. The kiss was deep, brief, and not nearly enough. When he drew back, his forehead rested against hers for the span of one hard breath. "Stay where people are," he said quietly. "With Shelley. With Giselle. With anybody but yourself." Ava's brow rose. "I am not 12. "No," Jake said, gaze locked on hers. "You're the one person in this world I cannot think clearly about when I believe you're in danger, which is considerably worse." That should have irritated her. Instead, it struck somewhere softer. Ava smoothed the front of his shirt, then curled her fingers around his belt at his waist and tugged him closer one last inch. "Come back to me, Sheriff." His eyes changed at the title. She knew what it did to him now. The old friction turned private endearment. "Always," he said, and then he was gone into the paling dark. By 9 o'clock, Ava had reorganized the glazed shelves at Copper and Clay twice, answered 3 customer emails incorrectly, and burned a batch of biscotti she had not even wanted to make. Shelley took one look at her and confiscated her apron. "You are pacing grooves into the floor," she said. "Sit down before you wear through the substructure of this building." Giselle arrived 20 minutes later with coffee, a legal pad, and the kind of purposeful expression that suggested she had appointed herself director of operations. "If we can't help in the field," she announced, "we can help here." Which means lists, logistics, and making sure you don't decide to do something dramatic and unwise. "Everyone in this town is very committed to implying I lack judgment," Ava muttered. "Not everyone," Shelley said. "Only the people who know you best." Despite herself, Ava smiled. This, too, was part of the life she had built. Women who did not flatter her but fortified her. Women who let her be sharp and stubborn and ambitious, and still showed up with coffee, practical shoes, and enough loyalty to form a barricade. The call came at 10:17, and it was not from Jake. Cheryl's voice over Ava's phone was calm enough to be alarming. "Sugar, I need you to listen and not panic." Ava was already on her feet. That sentence has never once prevented panic. The task force hit the yard. It was mostly cleared before they got there. They recovered 2 girls, but the main group had been moved overnight. Cheryl paused, and someone left a message in one of the offices. Ava's grip tightened on the phone. "What kind of message?" Cheryl exhaled. "It was addressed to you." Everything in the room went still. Jake called 37 seconds later. Ava answered before the second ring. "Tell me." His voice was clipped, controlled, and too flat. "There was a file left in the office. Copies of old campaign materials you designed in Chicago. Draft sponsorship forms. Intake sheets. Placement language. They weren't just using your name, Ava, they were studying your work. Whoever's running this knows you can identify the design, and they think you could either expose it or recreate it. Because of Daniel. Because somewhere along the line, your name stayed attached to materials they've been recycling for years, yes." He said it brutally, as if clean truth was safer than gentleness. "And there's more. We found notes about delivery routes, staffing lists, rental vehicles, and crowd movement for late September events. Not just county fairs. Weddings. Big public gatherings. If they mean to move people again, they're planning to do it while Meadow Grove is looking at flowers and white dresses instead of license plates. Jake, they're going to. Ava, leave it alone." The directive landed like a command and a plea at once. "Do exactly what I'm saying." She hated when he used that tone on her. She hated even more that he had earned the right. "Fine. I mean it." And I said fine. There was a beat of silence on the line, full of everything they did not have time to say. Then Jake's voice dropped. "I love you." Her throat tightened. "I know. Come back safe." She ended the call and turned to find Shelley and Giselle watching her with identical expressions of grim understanding. "Say it," Ava said. "We are not saying anything," Giselle replied. "We are escorting you to your house, locking every door, and taking shifts with you until this is over." That would have been the sensible plan. It might even have worked if Rosa had not returned, breathless and terrified, through the side alley 10 minutes later. She'd slipped away from the advocate's office in Evercrest because she had remembered one more thing, and fear had outrun protocol. "The girl," she said, hands shaking. "The girl who say find you. They move her separate. Boss man keep her because she young and pretty. She hear them say your name. They want woman from the flyers because she can make things look real." Ava stared. "They think I can help them build documents people will trust. Or lure people," Giselle said, voice going hard. Shelley went pale. "Call Jake." They tried. No answer. The county line location had patchy reception, Cheryl explained when Giselle rang dispatch again. The message would be relayed as soon as possible. Ava looked at Rosa. "Do you know where they keep the girl?" Rosa hesitated, then nodded. "Not yard. Old Mission Road. House with blue tank. Men leave in trucks. One stays." "Absolutely not," Shelley said at once, correctly reading the look that had come over Ava's face. "I'm not going there alone," Ava replied. "And I'm not going there to be reckless. But if that girl knows something that threatens the security of this town and Jake can't get the message in time, then law enforcement handles it," Giselle snapped. Ava turned to her, all the city-bred steel in her spine rising to the surface. "And if by the time they handle it, what, girls disappear into another county? Another state? Another set of documents get forged?" She shook her head. "Are you hard of hearing, Ava? This is about you now. These people know who you are. You're at risk." Giselle chided. "So is the girl. I know how men like Daniel move. They counted on decent people following procedure while they exploit time." Shelley put both hands on her hips. "You are starting to sound married to a sheriff." That almost made Ava laugh. Instead, she reached for her keys. "No, I'm sounding like myself." What followed would later be described, by everybody except the women involved, as an appalling plan. In practice, it was less a plan than a collision between urgency and determination. Giselle drove reluctantly because if they were doing this, she at least needed to get Ava home safely so Jake could tear her a new one. Ava rode beside Rosa, memorizing landmarks as they left town by a service road that cut through low brush and abandoned fencing. Shelley stayed behind to keep calling dispatch until someone answered with something more useful than wait. The house appeared 30 minutes later, crouched low against the land, sunstruck and ugly, with a faded blue water tank rising beside it. 2 trucks sat near a lean-to. Even from the road, Ava saw things that made her stomach turn cold. Stacks of folded rental chairs still strapped with tags from a vendor used for half the county's weddings, cardboard flower boxes with church donation labels turned inside out, and a pallet of bottled water stamped for volunteer distribution. The place looked less like a hideout than a transfer point disguised with the borrowed face of community service. That was worse. It meant the evil here did not live outside Meadow Grove's goodness. It had learned to wear it. "We are not going in," Giselle said. Ava was already opening her door. "We're getting eyes on it." They moved low along the side of a broken fence until they reached a stand of scrub near the back of the property. From there, Ava could see a rear window with a torn curtain and just for an instant, the pale oval of a face. Young, frightened. "Gone again." Rosa grabbed Ava's arm hard enough to hurt. "That's her." Then a door slammed somewhere on the far side of the house. Back, Giselle hissed. A man rounded the corner, not one of the towering brutes Ava might have expected, but a medium-built figure in work clothes and mirrored sunglasses, carrying a clipboard. He looked ordinary enough to pass for a contractor, a delivery supervisor, a groundskeeper. That was somehow worse. Monsters disguised as normal men had done the greatest damage in Ava's life. His gaze swept the yard and landed on the disturbed brush where they crouched. "Come on out," he called mildly. "I've already seen you." Every muscle in Ava's body locked. Beside her, Giselle muttered something vivid and unprintable under her breath. The man took another step. "Miss Thompson, I presume. From Chicago." The woman who understands that elevated design and respectable language makes desperate people step forward. So he knew her on sight. Ava rose slowly, calculation replacing shock. If he was talking, he was stalling. If he was stalling, he was either alone or waiting for backup. Either way, time mattered. "You know my name," she said. "Interesting, because I don't know yours." He smiled without warmth. "That's because my employer has an innate ability to focus on the main thing and dismiss the noise." "Who?" Ava asked, annoyed. "None other than your former companion, Miss Thompson. And he taught us a very useful principle, one that I think may resonate with you." The women just stared. "If one wraps shackles in benevolence, decent people will carry them for you," the man laughed. That reached exactly where he intended. "Daniel. Chicago. Her past." Ava felt the old humiliation try to flare and rejected it. "You mean the kind of cowardly bastards who dress kidnapping and assault as charity and call themselves businessmen?" she asked coolly. His smile thinned. "Language like that from the future, Mrs. Caldwell. Call me twisted, but I'd love to see you kiss your groom with that mouth in a couple of weeks." Ava's blood ran cold. If he knew about the wedding, he knew enough about Meadow Grove to be dangerous in ways deeper than she had guessed. "You picked the wrong town," Giselle said, stepping up beside Ava with her phone hidden against her leg, screen angled to capture video. "These people notice when a stranger breathes funny." "That," the man replied, "is becoming clear." He moved faster than Ava expected. One sharp whistle, one barked order in Spanish toward the house, and the entire stagnant yard seemed to wake. Another man appeared by the side door. The rear window slammed shut. Rosa let out a broken sound beside them. This was no longer reconnaissance. Ava stepped backward, already calculating the distance to the car. "Giselle." "On 3. Giselle muttered. 2, Ava said and ran. What followed happened in jagged fragments. The slam of boots on gravel behind them, Rosa crying out, Giselle yanking open the driver's side door, Ava lunging for the back passenger handle because Rosa had stumbled, a hand catching the edge of Ava's sleeve, the rip of fabric, the raw spike of adrenaline that sharpened everything to white light and sound. There was no graceful heroism in it, only chaos and instinct and women refusing to go quietly. Ava got Rosa shoved into the back seat just as one of the men seized her wrist. He was not stronger than terror and fury combined. She twisted hard, drove the heel of her palm up into his chin, and tore free long enough to get a leg inside the vehicle. Giselle hit the horn hard and continuous. The shriek of it split the air as the assailant reached for Ava again. Then another sound cut across the yard, the hard blare of a siren cresting the road. The man gripping her swore and released her. She staggered backward just as Jake's cruiser came through the front gate in a spray of dust and command presence, Deputy Mitchell close behind. Gravel spit beneath the tires. Doors flew open before the vehicles had fully stopped. Jake moved like a force of nature given legal authority. Ava would dream about that image for the rest of her days. The broad set of his shoulders, the command in his voice, the absolute focus with which he entered danger. There was no hesitation, no confusion, no wasted motion. One instant he was 20 feet away, the next he was between her and the men in the yard, issuing orders in a tone that made the air itself seem to obey. The confrontation broke in every direction at once. Mitchell moved toward the house. One suspect bolted for the side lot. Another surrendered with performative outrage. The man with the mirrored sunglasses kept backing up, his expression finally stripped of civility. Jake's attention tracked everything while somehow never losing Ava from the edge of his sight. That more than anything frightened her. Even in the center of a live operation, part of him was still oriented toward her. Weakness, he had called her. She saw the truth of it now and how dangerous love could be. "Get in the car." Jake barked without looking at her. Ava should have obeyed instantly. She might have, if not for the flash of movement at the rear window and the desperate face she had seen before. "The girl." "Still inside." "Jake," she shouted. "The back room." He heard her. Of course he heard her. His head snapped toward the house, and in that fractional shift of attention, the man in sunglasses made his move. He lunged not toward escape, but toward Ava. The world narrowed. Jake intercepted him before he reached her, but the impact of it carried both men sideways into the side of Giselle's car with a punishing crash. Ava stumbled back, heart hammering so hard it blurred her vision. Jake's control had always been a formidable thing, but she saw it strain now under the pressure of personal threat. His face was terrible in its focus. His voice, when it came, was all steel. "Mitchell! The house now!" The man was shouting as Mitchell moved on the house. Not denials now, but fragments, sponsors, donor lists, placement codes, church routing, local signatures. A bureaucrat of evil. A broker. Not the loudest villain Ava had ever known, but perhaps the most chilling, because he spoke like a man still convinced paperwork turned predation into policy. And buried in the rush of his panic was the worst part of all. He was naming people in Meadow Grove, not drifters. Not faceless outsiders. People with standing. People who sat on boards, signed letters, opened halls, vouched for storage access, approved volunteer deliveries. If even half of what he was screaming proved true, the scandal would not merely stain the town. It would rip through its most trusted institutions. Jake did not dignify a single word of it. He held the man on the ground with grim efficiency until county backup poured through the gate. The moment another officer took control, Jake was on his feet and in front of Ava, hands on her shoulders, eyes scanning her face, neck, arms, as if confirmation by sight alone could calm what terror had done to him. "Are you hurt?" "No." It should have ended there. It almost did. But Jake was still caught between sheriff and husband, and fear had burned all the softness out of him. "What the hell were you thinking, Ava?" he snapped. Ava blinked at him. "Excuse me." "You came out here," he said, voice low and lethal. "After I told you to stay put. After I said wait for law enforcement. You brought civilians into an active trafficking site with no backup and no way out." The words cascaded in front of deputies, medics, and a rescued witness. Humiliation hit Ava hot and immediate. "I came because there was a girl in that house," she said, each word honed sharp. "And because every minute decent people spend waiting for permission is a minute men like this use to move women out of reach." His jaw flexed. "You do not get to gamble your life because you don't trust our clock." "No," Ava shot back. "None of us gets to turn a blind eye while polished predators hide behind process and respectable paperwork. My old world taught me exactly what delay protects, and it is almost never the vulnerable." For one brutal second, they stood in the wrecked yard like strangers divided by the worst thing they each understood too well. Jake's face was cut hard by adrenaline, his anger only fear with nowhere safe to go. Ava's pulse was still running wild, but beneath it was a deeper hurt. He was speaking to her like a liability, not the woman who had walked beside him into every hard truth this case had uncovered. Deputy Mitchell emerged from the house with the missing girl wrapped in a county-issue blanket and another officer close behind him. She was pale, trembling, and very young, but she was alive, conscious, and clinging to the blanket with white-knuckled hands. That sight cut straight through the argument. Ava's breath left her. Jake turned at once, his expression hardening back into command as he moved to clear a path for the medics. The girl's name was Marisol. She looked at Ava once, only once, and whispered in a voice gone thin with exhaustion, "I knew you were real." That sentence would stay with Ava for the rest of her life. The balance of the morning passed in a blur of statements, vehicle searches, medical evaluations, and evidence collection. The man with the mirrored sunglasses turned out not to be the architect of the operation, but one of its skillful lieutenants, a coordinator who mistook documentation for absolution. His real name was Edwin Vicks. He moved between nonprofit contracting, logistical consulting, and event staffing across several states, always attached to ventures that positioned vulnerable people under respectable banners. He specialized in systems that looked lawful from a distance: grant paperwork, travel contracts, sponsorship packets, charitable placements. He recruited men who knew how to blend into communities in work boots and branded polos, carrying clipboards instead of obvious menace. But the true author of the damage, the man whose shadow stretched backward into Ava's old life and forward into Meadow Grove's threatened future, was not standing in that yard at all. He was waiting in federal custody, patient as decay, with a talent for making other men do his ugliest work. By noon, the task force had enough from the seized computers, ledgers, and phones to understand the breadth of the scheme and to recognize a pattern that made Ava physically cold. Much of the network's recent movement had been financed, advised, or redirected through shell entities linked back to one source, Daniel Elliott. Not as a field operator, not as a man loading vans in the dark, but as a strategist with the kind of white-collar depravity that preferred distance from the dirt. Before his fraud case collapsed his empire, Daniel had used community outreach campaigns tied to Allegiance Financial's charitable arm to gather aspiration data from vulnerable women, only to manipulate them with later. When his legal exposure deepened, he had sold access to that information and retained contact with the men who knew how to convert fragile hope into transportable profit. Worse, the Meadow Grove operation had not relied on outsiders alone. Using copied church sponsorship forms, event vendor credentials, and local charity correspondence, the ring had embedded itself inside the town's own habits of trust. Some local names appear to have been duped. Others had not. Evil was clearly afoot in Meadow Grove, wielding familiar signatures. Worse still, Daniel's reason for reaching into Ava's new life was no longer abstract. Vicks's seized messages and a sequence of recorded jail calls made it clear. Daniel blamed Ava not only for the loss of the hidden thumb drive that helped destroy his career, but for surviving him at all. He resented the clean lines of her reinvention, the small-town love story that had flourished where he had intended ruin, and the humiliating fact that frightened women now trusted the name he once treated as decorative on his campaigns. In his mind, Ava had taken three things that belonged to him: his leverage, his narrative, and his authority over the image he crafted of himself. Copper and clay, of all things, had become a countersymbol to his machinery, proof that one woman he failed to break could become a point of refuge for others. That made Ava more than inconvenient. It made her dangerous. If he could not reclaim control of his old life, he would corrupt her new one, frame her if necessary, and turn the wedding Meadow Grove adored into a screen behind which other women vanished. Jake gave his formal statement with visible composure. Ava knew better. By the time the final officer had left the property and Giselle had driven Rosa and Marisol to the advocacy team waiting in Evercrest, Jake looked like a man held together by discipline alone. He did not reach for Ava again. He did not apologize. He did not ask whether she would ride home with him. He simply took his hat from the hood of the cruiser, jammed it on with unnecessary force, and said, "Mitchell will escort you back." Ava looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said. Mitchell, a wise man at heart, abruptly discovered something riveting near the evidence van and removed himself from the blast radius. But even his retreat could not spare Ava the force of what followed in the days after. Jake did not take back his words. He did not soften them with immediate tenderness. He did not come home that night and gather her into forgiveness simply because danger had passed and love was still there. Instead, he retreated into a silence so controlled it felt like weather moving in. At first, Ava mistook it for exhaustion. They rode home in separate vehicles. Jake stopped by the station for reports and did not return until after midnight. When she woke in the darkness to the muted sound of the front door, she stayed still beneath the covers and listened to him move through the house with ghost-like precision. The bathroom faucet, the closet door, the soft shift of mattress on the far side of the bed. He did not reach for her. By dawn, he was gone again. The second morning, she woke earlier on purpose and found only the faint indentation his body had left in the mattress. The coffee pot had been set. A mug stood on the counter beside the sugar she liked. No note. No text beyond a clipped message sent at 5:12 a.m. Busy day. Deputy Parker will check in at the shop. Ava stared at that text for a full minute before setting her phone down face first on the kitchen table. Deputy Parker, not Jake, made the afternoon rounds at Copper and Clay that day. He was kind, respectful, and clearly aware that he had been assigned to a duty that should have belonged to someone else. On the third day, it was Mitchell. On the fourth, Jason Parker again. Jake's cruiser still passed the block at intervals she could track without looking up, but it never stopped. Not once. At home, the coldness was not loud. That made it worse. Jake was never cruel. He did not slam cabinets or weaponize silence with theatrics. He merely rationed himself. He came in late enough that she was often pretending to sleep or truly asleep from waiting too long. He rose before sunrise. He left his wedding ring hanging from the inconspicuous chain tucked beneath his shirt collar, his responsibilities intact, and his distance carefully measured. If she caught him in the kitchen and tried to start ordinary conversation, he answered politely, briefly, like a man preserving the integrity of a perimeter. Once, when she reached for his wrist as he moved past her to the mudroom, he stopped but did not turn. The line of his back beneath his work shirt looked carved from something unyielding. "I'm late, Ava," he said. 3 words. They sat in her chest all day like stones. The town noticed, of course. Meadow Grove noticed when dogs limped, when casserole dishes went unreturned, when marriages settled differently. But the town, to its credit, also knew when not to pry. Shelley limited herself to watching Ava too closely while refolding hand towels at the shop. Giselle was less restrained. "He is furious," she said bluntly over lunch on the 5th day. "And hurt. Also, for the record, you were both impossible." Ava pushed food around her plate, appetite non-existent. "I know he's hurt." "Do you?" Giselle challenged. "Because I think you understand he was angry." "I'm not sure you understand he was afraid in a way that made him feel helpless, and helplessness is not a place men like Jake stand comfortably." That struck harder than Ava wanted it to. She had spent so much energy replaying the humiliation of being chastised in front of deputies and witnesses that she had not fully sat inside the reality beneath it. Jake had not spoken from some primitive demand for obedience. He had spoken from terror. He had seen her nearly taken, nearly touched by the same machinery of violence he was fighting, and his fear had turned to anger because fear itself was unbearable. That realization did not erase her own hurt. It complicated it, which made sleep difficult and longing nearly intolerable. There were nights she would lie on her side of the bed and stare at the doorway, listening for his tread. When he finally appeared, she would keep her breathing even and wait for some sign that he meant to bridge the cold distance between them. It never came. Yet once, just once, she felt him stand over her side of the bed for a long, motionless moment in the dark. She kept her eyes closed. After a few seconds, his knuckles brushed very lightly over her hair, as if checking that she was real, as if tenderness had escaped him against his will, and then he stepped away. Ava nearly cried into the pillow after he left the room again. By the end of the first week, even Copper and Clay felt altered. Ava still taught classes, still glazed bowls and corrected invoices, still smiled at customers and let children press crooked little thumbprints into Clay. But beneath every ordinary interaction ran the ache of separation. She had not realized how much of her day had oriented itself around Jake's presence until it was removed. The quick drive-by at noon. The coffee on the counter when she returned from sourcing supplies. The text that said "lock up soon, I'm nearby." His absence had shape. It touched everything. On the 9th day, she found him accidentally, or perhaps not accidentally at all, late in the evening at the edge of Main Street. She was carrying the last box of event cards into her SUV when Jake's cruiser rolled to a stop at the far curb. For one instant, their eyes met through the windshield. His face gave nothing away. Then Deputy Parker stepped out of the passenger side instead, crossed the street, and took the box from her without a word. Jake drove on. Ava stood there in the parking lot with her keys in her hand, and a sensation very much like heartbreak blooming all through her ribs. That was the night she stopped being angry enough to protect herself with pride. She went home, sat at the kitchen table in the house that still smelled faintly of his aftershave and cedar soap, and finally let herself admit the full scope of what the distance was doing to her. She missed her husband. Not abstractly, not in wounded vanity, but in the bone-deep way one misses the steadying presence that has become woven through daily life. More than that, she understood now that his withdrawal was not punishment in the cheap sense. It was injury. He had been cut open by the possibility of losing her and was trying, poorly but sincerely, to master himself before he came near her again. Once Ava understood that, the separation became unbearable. So, on the 11th day, after closing Copper and Clay and ignoring both Shelley's caution and Giselle's look of grim approval, Ava drove to the sheriff's office just before dusk and walked inside wearing determination like armor. The station had its usual hum: radios, boots, clacking keyboards, the scent of burnt coffee, and old metal filing cabinets. Cheryl looked up from dispatch and took one glance at Ava's face before deliberately lowering her eyes back to her console. "Sheriff's in his office," she said. "If anybody asks, I did not see you arrive." Ava didn't knock. She opened the door and stepped inside, then closed it behind her with enough firmness to announce intent without dramatics. Jake looked up from a spread of case files, and for one suspended second, the whole room changed density. He had shed the uniform shirt for a plain dark Henley, sleeves shoved to the forearms, gun belt resting on the credenza behind him. His badge lay beside an open legal pad. He looked tired enough to break the heart of anyone who loved him, which unfortunately included Ava. The office itself was exactly what one might expect of Sheriff Caldwell: neat, sparse, efficient, every object placed with purpose. But there were traces of her in it now too: a mug she had bought him at a holiday market, a small, glazed dish on the shelf for paper clips, the subtle softening that happened when a hard room got used to the idea of love. "Ava." His voice was flat with surprise and caution. "You shouldn't be here this late." "That sounds familiar." She stood where she was, hands at her sides, because she did not trust herself to fold them without appearing defensive. "If you tell me to leave, I won't. So save us both the wasted breath." Jake leaned back in his chair slowly, watching her with the kind of focus that once made suspects reconsider lies. "This is a place of business." "No," Ava said softly. "This is the place you've been hiding from me." Something moved in his face then. Not enough to count as surrender, but enough to prove the strike had landed true. "I have been working. And avoiding me." He held her gaze. "Yes." The honesty of it took some of the fight out of her. Ava crossed the room in 3 measured steps and stopped at the edge of his desk. Then I'm done letting you. Jake stood. He was a big man in a small office, all restrained energy and the remnants of 2 hard weeks. You think I'm hiding because I'm angry. You are angry. I am. His jaw flexed. But anger isn't the part that made me keep my distance. Ava waited. Jake's hands braced on the desk, broad palms flattening over case files and witness statements. I was afraid that if I came home and looked at you too soon, I'd either say something I couldn't take back or I'd touch you and forget I had any right to be furious. His voice was rougher now, lower, no longer fit for public use. And I needed to know which man was walking through the door. Your husband or the sheriff whose orders you ignored. The admission ran through her like heat and grief interlaced. Jake, don't. He straightened, eyes on hers, all that disciplined distance suddenly under strain. Do not come in here saying my name like that if you aren't prepared to hear everything I've been trying not to say. Ava's heart thudded. She stepped around the corner of the desk until only a foot of space remained between them. Then stopped trying. The silence that followed was electric. Jake's gaze dropped to her mouth and stayed there too long to be called accidental. Ava could feel the exact moment his control began to fracture. It happened in the slight shift of his breathing, the slight opening of his hand at his side, the way his shoulders seemed to lower in surrender to a truth he had already lost too much sleep denying. I hated how badly you scared me, he said. I looked at that yard and saw 10 ways I could lose you in under a minute. Ava swallowed. And I hated being spoken to like a reckless deputy in front of half your department when I was standing there shaking and trying not to look at what almost happened. For the first time since she arrived, Jake's composure faltered. Just slightly. Enough for Ava to see the crack in it. I know, he said, voice low. I know exactly what I did. Some of the force went out of her then, replaced by sheer exhaustion. Then why did you let it live between us? Jake dragged a hand through his hair. A phone rang somewhere beyond the office door. Because I'd lived this nightmare once before, Ava. You knew that, knew the terror I felt at holding your limp body, at the thought of losing you. Yet you willingly put yourself in danger anyway. He looked up then, his expression stark and unguarded. I am sorry. For the yard. For freezing you out after. For making my fear sound like authority. That apology was not polished. It had no sheriff's steadiness to it, no public-facing dignity. It was simply Jake, stripped down to accountability and fear. Ava stepped closer. I was wrong and thoughtless and insensitive, she said. I know. And I was reckless. His mouth tightened. Also correct. But I will not apologize for refusing to let evil move faster than decency. She set her palm over his heartbeat. What I will apologize for is forgetting that if I throw myself at danger, I don't just risk me. I risk us. Jake closed his eyes. The answer to that touched somewhere too deep for words. When he opened them again, the glacial hardness was gone. In its place was the devastating gentleness only Ava ever fully drew from him. Come here, he growled. That did it. The distance of days collapsed all at once. Ava lifted onto her toes and kissed him with enough force to silence the next word before it formed. Jake made a sound low in his chest that bordered on surrender and devastation. Then his other hand came to her waist and he pulled her flush against him, the edge of the desk biting into his thighs as the rest of the room disappeared. The kiss was not neat. It was 2 weeks of hurt, love, anger, fear, and starved tenderness finally given somewhere to go. Ava tasted every withheld thing in it. Jake kissed her like a man who had spent 11 nights sleeping beside absence and had run out of patience for restraint. He broke away only long enough to look at her, one hand sliding into her hair, eyes dark with feeling. Tell me to stop. Ava's laugh was shaky and breathless. That seems wildly unlikely. The smile that touched his mouth at that was brief and dangerous. He turned them, pressing her very gently back against the closed office door, and lowered his forehead to hers. For a suspended moment, they simply inhaled each other in. Then Jake kissed the line of her jaw, the corner of her mouth, the place beneath her ear that made her knees weaken every single time. Ava's hands fisted in the front of his Henley. Outside the office, radios still crackled and boots still crossed the station floor, but in here the world had narrowed to heat, breath, and the exquisite ache of reunion. Try as they might, their coupling was not quiet, the passion between them gathering like a storm. It was all there in the way he murmured her name against her skin as if it hurt and healed him in the same breath, and in the way she drew him back to her mouth because even after marriage, after danger, after silence, she still could not quite get enough of the man. Eventually, Jake exhaled a laugh that sounded like defeat in the best possible sense and rested his cheek against her hair. This is an appallingly unprofessional use of county property. Then arrest me, Ava whispered. His shoulders shook once with quiet laughter. When he leaned back enough to look at her again, the anger had not vanished, but it had finally been joined by everything else. Love, relief, exhaustion, need. Come home with me, she said. That night, after the station emptied down to distant murmurs and a deputy's faint laugh in the parking lot, they told the truth. Not to the town, not yet, but to each other in the complete language of marriage, which required more than devotion and desire. Ava confessed that part of her still believed catastrophe could arrive without warning and take any joy she loved too openly. Jake confessed that being needed by a whole town had trained him to confuse responsibility with control, and that loving Ava exposed every fracture in that instinct. They spoke until words ran thin, then fell into the gentler quiet that comes only after real honesty. Later, inside the hush of their bedroom, Jake stood behind her at the dresser and helped take down the braided bun atop her head. The tenderness of it nearly undid her more than any grand speech could have. His fingers brushed her neck, her shoulder, the line where silk met skin. When he caught her gaze in the mirror, the look in his eyes held all the rough love and reverence she had come to trust. He lowered his mouth to her temple and lingered there. Ava leaned back into him without thinking, giving him the unguarded weight of her body. The room around them faded to lamplight and the quiet promise of belonging. Nothing after that needed words. The intimacy was there in the way he touched her as if she were both beloved and breakable, and in the way she turned in his arms as if there was nowhere else on earth she had ever been meant to stand. The investigation widened over the next month. With testimonies from Rosa and Marisol, digital records from the county line property, and documentation Ava helped decode from the old Chicago campaign files, the task force finally saw the complete infrastructure. Several charitable outreach campaigns tied to Daniel Elliott's former corporate circles had functioned as recruitment funnels, gathering personal data and aspiration profiles from women desperate for legitimate opportunities. Men like Vix then repurposed those lists into trafficking pipelines hidden behind relocation, employment, and sponsorship promises. Meadow Grove had not been chosen because it was weak. It had been chosen because it was trusting, beautiful, and logistically convenient. Evil preferred places that looked innocent from a distance. The knowledge shook the town. It also changed it. Jake, who had once viewed border movement through the blunt lens of law and violation, now spoke with a sharper understanding born of what he had seen. He held community meetings at the church hall and invited county advocates, survivor support staff, and state investigators to explain how coercion worked, how false sponsorships were structured, how ordinary people could spot the signs of trafficking without reducing every outsider to a threat. Ava stood in the back of the room at the first meeting and watched the town listen to him, not just because he was their sheriff, but because he had allowed complexity into his authority. It made him stronger, not softer. And when he spotted her there and his expression eased despite the weight of the subject, it reminded everyone in attendance that his strength had not dimmed by love. It had been deepened by it. Ava found her own new stride too. If Meadow Grove had once tested her city instincts, it now gave them purpose. She helped redesign intake materials for the advocacy office in Evercrest so they used clear language, culturally aware visuals, and less patronizing assumptions. She created discreet information cards that could be tucked into market bags, library books, and church bulletins, beautiful enough not to arouse suspicion, practical enough to get help into frightened hands. Copper and Clay began hosting monthly open studio nights whose proceeds supported shelters and legal aid for displaced women. People came first because they liked Ava. They kept coming because they believed in what she was building. The town no longer saw her as simply the stylish outsider with pottery wheels and big city opinions. They saw her as theirs and as distinctly herself. Both at once. Shelley and Giselle naturally took full credit for this transformation. "We civilized you," Shelley declared one afternoon while pinning swatches to a board for the reception table decor. "No," Ava replied, adjusting a stack of handmade escort cards. "You accessorized my competence." Giselle snorted. That may be the most Ava sentence ever spoken. The wedding stayed on the calendar. But another family truth had pressed quietly at the edges of Ava's joy. Her parents were still in Toronto. They had remained there through the first year of her marriage, through the planning, through the investigation, and through several phone calls that always began carefully and ended strained. The root of it went back to Grand Odessa's death. When Odessa willed the Meadow Grove house and related holdings to Ava instead of her father, the old injury in the family split open and never properly healed. Her father believed the property should have gone to him as Odessa's eldest son. Ava believed Odessa had seen clearly what would become of the house under each of their care. Neither position left much room for peace. After Ava chose not to sell, chose instead to restore the place, move into it, and build a life around it, the disagreement hardened into something more personal. Her mother tried to mediate. Her father withdrew into injured pride. Ava, weary of being treated like an ungrateful beneficiary instead of a grieving granddaughter, stopped trying to make each conversation easier than truth allowed. The result was not estrangement exactly, but distance heavy enough to ache. Yet, even with the disappointment and uncertainty around her parents' comportment, Ava still looked forward to the wedding. That surprised her at first. She had expected, after everything, that she might want privacy again. Smaller, quieter, hidden. But that feeling never came. The secret marriage had been precious. The public wedding, she realized now, would be something else, not proof, not correction, but witness. A declaration that what had been nearly corrupted by fear had survived and flowered anyway. Jake agreed at once. "I want everyone there," he said. "I want them to see what they're celebrating." So Meadow Grove prepared itself with near operatic enthusiasm. The church was dressed in late summer flowers and terracotta ribbons, the color Ava had finally chosen for the reception. Canyon Cross Diner catered the rehearsal supper, and patrons still argued over who deserved praise for the peach cobbler. Boots and buckles strung lights over the dance floor in case the celebration spilled that far into the night. Men who claimed to have no opinions about weddings spent entire afternoons discussing tent placement. Elderly women at church patted Ava's cheek and gave her contradictory advice about preserving a husband's peace. Teenage girls from her pottery classes volunteered to arrange centerpieces with a seriousness usually reserved for exams and first love. On the morning of the ceremony, Ava stood in the old bedroom at her grandmother's house with Shelley and Giselle circling her like devoted, bossy satellites. Her gown was elegant rather than extravagant, soft ivory, clean lines, a fitted bodice, and a skirt that moved like water when she turned. Her hair was swept back enough to reveal the line of her neck, and the small pearl earrings Shelley insisted were lucky because they had witnessed the first wedding too. "You're staring at yourself like you're about to negotiate a merger," Giselle observed. Ava huffed a laugh. "I'm thinking." Shelley came up behind her and met her gaze in the mirror. About him. About all of it, Ava admitted. How strange it is that I can stand here in a place I never meant to live, about to marry a man I never would have looked twice at in Chicago, and feel more like myself than I ever did there. Giselle smiled rare and soft. That's because this place didn't shrink you. It met you. Ava blinked hard and looked away before the emotion could ruin her makeup. At the church, Jake waited at the front in a dark suit that made him look even more dangerous than his uniform somehow managed to. Broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, posture exact, he stood with that signature stillness of his while the sanctuary filled. Yet everybody in the first few pews could see the tell that gave him away. His right hand flexed once, then again, at his side. Jake Caldwell, who could stare down armed men without blinking, was nervous. He became motionless in an entirely different way when Ava appeared. The music started. The congregation rose. Sun poured through the church windows in pale gold sheets. And at the back of the aisle, Ava stood for one suspended heartbeat with her hand on the arm of the man walking her forward. Not a father, not a brother, but old Mr. Withers from Evercrest, now retired from the bench, who had signed their private marriage license and cried shamelessly when Ava asked if he would do her this honor. Then she started toward Jake. She saw the moment his carefully mastered composure gave way. Not publicly, not enough for anyone to tease him over forever, though that would not stop them. But in the slight softening of his mouth, the sudden brightness at the edges of his eyes, the reverent disbelief of a man who had once already been granted the very thing he wanted most and still found himself awed by it. When she reached him, Jake took her hand with a care so deliberate it felt intimate despite the 100 watching eyes. His thumb brushed once across the band hidden beneath her engagement ring, and Ava knew at once that he was thinking the same impossible thought she was. We are already here, and yet somehow we are arriving again. The minister spoke beautifully. The town sniffled openly. Shelley cried without restraint. Giselle denied crying while crying. And then, at the point where vows should have begun, Ava looked at Jake and knew the moment had come. Before we do this, she said, voice steady though her pulse was anything but, there's something we need to tell all of you. A ripple ran through the pews. Jake turned to her with the faintest hint of alarm, and she almost laughed because there, finally, was the one expression she had not often managed to surprise out of him. Ava squeezed his hand. We wanted a wedding with all of you, she said, turning to face the packed church. But the truth is, this isn't the day we became husband and wife. The silence that followed was complete and glorious. Jake let out one soft breath that was almost a laugh, almost surrender. Then he lifted their joined hands and spoke into the stunned quiet with the calm authority of a man confessing to a misdemeanor he would cheerfully commit again. We married in the spring, he said. Quietly, before a clerk, a judge, and exactly 2 women in this room who are no longer to be trusted with classified information. The church erupted. There were gasps, delighted shouts, scandalized laughter, and at least one indignant "I knew it" from the back pews. Cheryl Glenn put both hands over her face and cackled. Mr. Withers looked as smug as a man in a church reasonably could. Shelley and Giselle wore identical expressions of satisfied wickedness. Through it all, Jake never stopped looking at Ava. When the noise finally settled, he turned fully toward her. I had a speech prepared about waiting for this day, he murmured, low enough for only her and the minister to hear. Now I'm going to need a different one. Ava's smile shook a little. You'll improvise. So he did. Jake's vows were not ornate. They were better. He promised constancy before passion failed, honesty before pride hardened, partnership before fear isolated. He promised to remember that Ava was not something fragile to be controlled, but a force to be cherished, trusted, and met with equal courage. He promised to keep making a life with her that was wide enough for her ambition, her sharp edges, her art, her laughter, her storms, and her peace. By the time he finished, half the church was crying again and the other half looked ready to volunteer as witnesses for any future vow renewals. Ava's own vows were delivered with less visible composure than she had intended and far more truth than she had planned to reveal. She promised not only love but witness, to see him whole, not merely heroic, to remind him that strength and tenderness were not enemies, to keep choosing the life they had made, especially when old fears tried to convince her happiness was temporary. And because the whole town was watching and because she could not resist, she added, "I also vow not to undertake unsanctioned rescue missions without first notifying my husband, unless absolutely necessary." The sanctuary broke into laughter, and Jake bowed his head as if receiving deserved punishment. When he looked back up, the smile on his face was so open, so helplessly in love, that Ava almost forgot where they were. The minister pronounced them married to a roar of appreciation better suited to a championship game than a church service. Jake kissed her then, not indecently, not even for as long as he clearly wanted to, but with enough depth and certainty that every person present understood this was no pageant romance. This was earned, fought for, tempered under pressure, and brought back to light. The reception unfolded like the town had been rehearsing for it in secret all year. Children chased each other under tables draped in terracotta linens. The diner staff received applause with every tray. Elderly couples claimed the best seats and judged the cake in murmured tones of expertise. Copper and clay centerpieces glowed in the late light, each one handmade by Ava and her students. There were speeches, stories, and at least 3 inappropriate toasts cut short by sensible women. The surprise came just after the second toast, when Ava had finally sat down long enough to taste the meal everybody had argued over for weeks. She heard her name across the reception hall in a voice she had not heard in person for years, and turned so fast her chair nearly tipped backward. 2 women stood at the edge of the dance area, both elegant, both familiar in the unmistakable way of blood remembered from childhood summers. Emery Thompson reached her first, arms open, laughter already breaking under emotion. Alana was one step behind, smiling through tears she was making no effort to deny. For one disbelieving second, Ava could only stare. Then she was on her feet and in their arms all at once. "What the?" Ava squealed with delight as she willingly crumpled the sateen of her dress with an overwhelming and affectionate hug. "Thank Giselle," the women both laughed with equal delight. As if orchestrated by divine providence, they all immediately caught sight of Giselle across the bustling space, where she simply winked in acknowledgement. The trio had once been inseparable in the way cousins were when summer seemed endless, and a grandmother's house felt like the center of the world. Emery, Alana, and Ava had run barefoot through Grand Odessa's backlot, stolen whole pies from cooling windowsills, ruined towels with river mud, and built entire kingdoms out of adobe dust and girlhood certainty. Then Emery and Alana's family had moved from Illinois to Missouri. Adulthood had happened in different states and under different pressures, and closeness had been maintained mostly through messages, holiday calls, and promises to visit that never aligned with real life. Seeing them now here, at her wedding, beneath the same broad western light Odessa had loved, struck Ava so deeply she had to hold herself still just to keep from crying all over both of them. "You sneaky heifer," Alana said, pulling back to look at her. "Secret marriage. We had to hear that in real time with the rest of these people." Ava laughed through tears. "You were supposed to be a surprise, not a scolding." "We can do both," Emery informed her warmly, and then Jake was there at her shoulder, one hand settling at the small of her back with instinctive steadiness. Introductions moved quickly after that. Emery bright-eyed and sharp as ever. Alana, elegant and observant, the same composed force Ava remembered from girlhood, only refined by time. And with them stood Emery's new husband, Alexander, impeccably dressed, self-possessed, and carrying the easy confidence of a man used to moving in rooms where money spoke before people did. Jake's posture changed imperceptibly when they shook hands. Not colder exactly, but alert in a new direction. Ava felt it and nearly smiled. Her husband could read the weight of a man in a single grip. "We brought a wedding gift," Emery said a little later, after she and Alana had demanded photographs, updates, and a full explanation of how the sheriff had gone from an intimidating stranger to family. She withdrew an envelope from her clutch and handed it to Ava with a grin that suggested trouble. Inside was a card, a note full of love, and a check with everything filled in except the amount. Jake glanced down, then looked immediately back at Alexander with open suspicion. "Absolutely not." Emery laughed. "I knew he'd do that." Alexander did not appear offended. If anything, he seemed to respect the reaction. "Man to man," he said, shifting his attention fully to Jake, "I've read enough and heard enough tonight to know that what you're trying to build out here matters. Your trafficking victim support initiative is the kind of thing that needs backing if it's going to outlive headlines and public outrage. This isn't charity theater. It's an investment offer in structure." Jake's expression remained polite and immovable. "I want nothing to do with anything that looks remotely like what I uncovered from Allegiance Financial's community outreach efforts," he said. "No shell benevolence. No branded compassion. No money that needs a photograph more than it needs a plan." Alexander absorbed that without defensiveness. He gave one short nod. "Understood. And fair. Consider the feedback received exactly as stated." His gaze flicked briefly toward Ava, then back to Jake. "My interest and any offer of partnership are legitimate. If and when you're ready, I'd like to talk business the right way, with transparency, local control, and a structure that protects the people you're trying to serve. Until then, the check stays a wedding gift. Use it, burn it, frame it, or ignore it." There was something unexpectedly clean about that answer. Jake seemed to recognize it too. Some of the hardness in his face eased. "I can respect that," he said. "Good," Emery announced. "Now that the men have finished circling each other, I'd like cake." A little later, away from the crush of guests and the teasing racket near the bandstand, Alana touched Ava's arm gently. "Where are Uncle Dale and Aunt Sophie?" she asked, glancing around with the tact of someone who already suspected the answer. "I kept looking for them." For a brief second, Ava looked down at the condensation on her glass before answering. "Toronto," she said. Then, because these were not strangers and because the day had already demanded truth in abundance, she added, "Things have been strained since Gran passed. Mostly because of the house and everything she left me. My father thinks it should have gone to him. I think Gran Odessa knew exactly what she was doing. We haven't really seen eye to eye since." Alana's expression softened immediately. "I'm sorry, Ava." Ava gave a small shrug that fooled none of them. "We're taking it one day at a time." Jake had approached quietly enough that Ava did not realize he was there until his palm moved over the small of her back in one slow, reassuring pass. The gesture was intimate enough to steady her and subtle enough not to turn pain into a spectacle. "And if one day at a time is all we get for a while," he said, voice low and even, "then we'll take that." But she won't be taking it alone. Ava looked up at him then and saw, with a clarity that nearly broke her open, that he meant every part of it. Ready, willing, and able to be the family she needed if her own could not yet manage the shape of her life. Emery's eyes went suspiciously bright. Alana reached over and squeezed Ava's hand. Somewhere out on the dance floor, Shelley was yelling for the bouquet toss as if emotion and logistics ought never to be separated for too long. And then there was dancing. When Jake led Ava onto the floor at Boots and Buckles later that evening, the room responded exactly as it had the first time they ever danced there, with interest, anticipation, and no sense of restraint whatsoever. He settled one hand at her back, took her other hand in his, and looked down at her with that same dangerous focus he had worn on the night everything between them first shifted. Only now there was no question between them, no tug-of-war between suspicion and desire. There was only recognition. "Still think I'm insufferable?" he murmured as the band struck up a slow number before giving way to something with a steadier country sway. Ava smiled up at him. I think you were the first thing about this town I got completely wrong. Not the last, I hope. No. Her gaze softened. Definitely not the last. They moved together with the ease of people who had learned one another not only in romance, but in ordinary mornings, hard conversations, shared danger, and private delight. Jake was still light on his feet despite his size, still precise, still infuriatingly in command of every turn and pause. Ava followed and answered, not yielding herself so much as choosing each step with him. Around them, the town cheered, laughed, and called out teasing remarks, but the noise blurred at the edges. At the center of it was only the warm press of his hand, the firm support at her back, the measured strength in the body that had stood between her and harm again and again. When he spun her in close at the end of the song and her breath caught against his throat, he bent his head and said, "You know they're going to talk about us for years." "Let them," Ava replied. "Maybe they'll finally get the story right." Much later, after the lights dimmed and the last of the guests wandered home happy and overfed, Jake carried Ava over the threshold of the same little house where so much of their life had already begun. She protested on principle. He ignored her on instinct. In the quiet that followed, the house seemed to settle around them with contentment. He set her down in the entryway but did not step back. For a moment they simply looked at one another, all the public joy gone private now. Ava reached up and loosened his tie. Jake slid a hand along her waist and drew her close enough that her gown brushed his trouser legs. The tenderness between them had changed over the year, deepened by trust and sharpened by survival. It was no longer only anticipation. It was homecoming. His mouth found hers in a kiss that was unhurried and certain, and when she sighed against him, he smiled into it with unmistakable affection. Outside, the river moved through the dark, steady as a promise. Inside, the future waited, no longer shadowed by the unfinished business of their past. There would still be hard days. Meadow Grove would still gossip. Jake's work would still ask difficult things of him. Ava would still occasionally bristle at small-town assumptions and stubbornly wear impractical shoes where dust had no respect for fashion. But those were no longer threats to happiness. They were simply the textures of a real life, the lived-in details of a love sturdy enough to survive weather. And somewhere beyond the windows, beyond the river and the roads and the town that had learned to hold them both, dawn would come again to Meadow Grove. The light would touch copper earth and river clay. It would find a sheriff with a disciplined heart and a woman who had made art out of survival. And in the home they had built from trust, candor, heat, and grace, Jake and Ava would wake to one another exactly as they had fought to do, not as people merely hoping for happily ever after, but as the rare and radiant proof that they had earned it.